Good afternoon and welcome to the International Poetry Forum. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Jake Greffenstedt. I'm the executive director of this nonprofit organization. Is anyone here at the International Poetry Forum for the first time? Oh, brilliant. Oh, it's so good to see. You may know we were launched on this stage with a reading by Archibald MacLeish almost exactly 59 years ago. And we've had an incredible lineup of about 800 poets, including some friends, teachers, and predecessors of our poets today, like W.H. Auden, Seamus Heaney, Elizabeth Bishop, Derek Walcott, and more. Pittsburgh is truly one of the great literary cities. We would like to say thank you to Mr. Tomlin and the Steelers for scheduling their bye week around this special event. And we would like to say thank you for welcoming back the International Poetry Forum. We just relaunched last year after a 15-year hiatus. You will have received a postcard as you came in. There's a QR code on the back that tells you more about our organization. We exist because of the generosity of small donors across town. So we have our note of gratitude to our donors. Everyone we have to thank is there. I just want to say thank you to our volunteers for coming, for Dr. Samuel Hazo, our founder, who is in great health and still publishing at 97. But today we have something truly, truly special. We have today a poet who is the best kind of poet because he's a poet who makes people love poetry. You would think that's a given. You'd hope that any great poet makes people love poetry, but it's unfortunately not always the case. But Sir Andrew Motion, who served as the Poet Laureate of the United Kingdom, succeeding figures like Tennyson and Wordsworth, is a great poet in that tradition and also deeply engaged in his world. He was really unusual as Poet Laureate in that he came in and he was immediately writing about daily life. He was writing in response to crises of homelessness, in response to the 9/11 crisis, and he's continued to be a major force in education, teaching over at Johns Hopkins University. Sir Motion is one of my personal heroes. I heard him read for the first time in 2011 at the University of Oxford, and I've never forgotten it. I can say with confidence that this event, and certainly I would not be here without hearing that reading. So if it's the case, as one of my friends said in the back, you know, I'm curious to see how this goes. I'm not sure about this poetry thing. I heard Sir Motion, and I have done little with my life but poetry, so be warned. But this is a truly special guest. We're so happy you all could be here today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sir Andrew Motion.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you, Jake, so much for that extremely kind and generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. Rather astonished to see so many of you, of course, especially on a beautiful afternoon like this, but I'm extremely pleased to see you. As you know, I've been invited to say a little bit about one of my favorite writers, John Keats, before I read you some of my own poems. I first read Keats's poems in the way that teenagers do read poems, i.e. kind of paying not 100% attention to it. When I was at school, and I suppose about 15, 16 years old, something like that, so it's coming up to 60 years ago. And the idea of Keats that I was given then was of somebody who, unlike most of the great romantic poets, first and second generation romantic poets, Keats was described to me as somebody who really hadn't engaged much with the life of his times. Wordsworth and Coleridge, as young men certainly, not as older men, were climbing the barricades with the best of them. Shelley, we know about him, passionately engaged with the political life of his times. And in contrast to that, the received idea seemed to be that Keats was somebody who flopped around on beds made of lilies and really had absolutely nothing to do with what was going on beyond the window or outside his own head. And I like to think that even at the time, even at that early first reading of Keats, that didn't seem to me a very adequate description of what was actually going on in the poems, let alone in his life. I didn't immediately think that I would, in many years later, write a biography of Keats in order to try and sort of set the record as I saw it straight. I would like to think that I had immediately thought of doing such a thing, but I doubt it. But the time did come many years later when I had the chance to write about Keats. And that was the line about him that I wanted to take. I wanted to root him in the life of his times and explore the way in which the poems interact with the extremely tumultuous political life of his times. And when one begins to think about that, the obvious place is to begin at the beginning with Keats's birth and upbringing. He was born on the eastern edge of London, and that edginess is very important, I think. He was the son of what in those days was called an ostler. If you lived outside town and you wanted to come to town for the day, you rode in on your horse, you gave it to the ostler who ran, Keats's dad ran this outfit on the edge of town in Moorgate. You'd, as it were, park your horse in the ostlery, and then you'd go on and do your business in town, and you'd pick the horse up again once you wanted to go back to your place outside the city. So a working class upbringing on the edge of town. His father died in a riding accident when John Keats was still very young. His mother eventually married again in a rather complicated way that needn't concern us now. He was raised mostly by his grandmother in a village which has now been subsumed by London, but again, sort of on the edge of things, and educated at really what was a dissenting academy nearby, run by a man called Cowden Clarke, whose son, Cowden Clarke's son, was a near contemporary of Keats's, became a friend of Keats. And where all this leads us towards is the first important and memorable poem that Keats wrote, which is on first looking into Chapman's Homer. After a dinner with Cowden Clarke, who'd borrowed from a mutual friend of theirs, a guy who actually worked for the Times newspaper, a copy of Chapman's translation of the Iliad. They sat up all night poring over this thing. Keats absolutely enraptured by this volume. And as the dawn was breaking, Keats went home to his digs near where Guy's Hospital now is, because by this time Keats, who didn't go to university, was doing his medical training, the plan being for him to become a doctor. And as on the other side of town, Cowden Clarke sat down to have his breakfast, the postman knocked on the door and gave him a copy of this sonnet. In other words, Keats had gone home in such a state of excitement about reading this volume that he hadn't gone to bed, he'd sat down and written the poem. And we have the manuscript of the poem, it survives, only one crossing out. A real kind of burst of inspired writing. But a poem which, familiar as it is, I think we should read most fruitfully as an example of somebody who feels like an outsider, who's desperate to join in. He desperately wants to be inside the world of high culture, which the poem celebrates. But he realizes in the course of the poem, as it were, behind the drapery of the poem, that this is going to be a lifetime's effort. So a poem full of excitement, a poem poised at a penultimate moment, like a lot of Keats's poems, and actually, interestingly, like a lot of Tennyson's poems, too. Tennyson being very influenced by Keats. It's got a few mistakes in it. It wasn't Cortes who first saw the Pacific, it was Bilboa. But that tells you something about the kind of guy Keats was, something about his background. And even though I'm going to read it in my voice, as it were, I always like to think that Keats, as a Cockney, must have had a Cockney accent. And if you think about how this poem would sound in a Cockney accent, it adds something to this sense of Keats as the aspiring person, the urgently aspiring person. This poem is written on the 16th of October, 1817. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. That reference to the new planet, by the way, as some of you probably know, is a reference to Herschel's discovery of Uranus, which had in fact only been seen by Herschel for the first time a few years previously. Herschel spotted it. He didn't realize it was a planet initially, but it was quickly recognized to be a planet in March 1781. So this was still a new discovery at the time that Keats was writing the poem. Everything happens very fast in Keats's life. People talk about young poets. Keats is never anything except a young poet, but he does grow up extremely quickly, imaginatively and morally and intellectually. And the next poem that I'm going to read you is actually an extract from something he writes pretty close to the end of his life, in fact. In the middle of July 1819, so this is about 2 years later, 2 years on from the Chapman's Homer sonnet, he starts to write a poem about the fall of Hyperion, and gets stuck with it after a lot of very agonized fiddling around with trying to move forward, gives it up, and then goes back to it wearing a slightly different hat, hitting the subject from a slightly different angle a few months later, in the autumn of 1818 into April 1819. And the subject of this poem is, of course, the fall of Hyperion, the god Hyperion, but what it really is, the poem centrally, is a meditation on suffering and on the need for a poet, a writer of any kind really, to decide how they want to deal with this. Are they going to turn their back on it and just sort of wander around and have nothing to do with things? That was certainly the idea of Keats that was given to me when I was reading him as a teenager. Or do we want to square up to it, look it in the eye, and realize that suffering is part of life whether we like it or not? The key moment in the poem, I think, which is only a fragment, is when the narrator of the poem goes to visit Monetta's shrine. Monetta Mnemosyne is the figure of memory, and this gigantic figure, probably modelled imaginatively by Keats on some of those colossal figures statues that he'd been to see in the British Museum, which was just beginning to become the thing that we now know it to be in his day. The speaker presents himself at the shrine of Monetta Mnemosyne to contemplate how memory works. Her face is inscribed with all the suffering that she's seen, and would be so terrifying to look on without any kind of intervention that she wears a veil. And I think that's probably all you need to know to work out what's going on here. So this is a bit from the beginning of the first book of this wonderful fragment. There was a silence while the altar's blaze was fainting for sweet food. I looked thereon, and on the paved floor, where nigh were piled faggots of cinnamon and many heaps of other crisped spicewood. Then again I looked upon the altar, and its horns whitened with ashes, and its languorous flame, and then upon the offerings again, and so by turns, till sad Monetta cried, "The sacrifice is done, but not the less will I be kind to thee for thy good will. My power, which is to me still a curse, shall be to thee a wonder, for the scenes still swooning vivid through my globed brain, with an electral changing misery, thou shalt with those dull mortal eyes behold, free from all pain, if wonder pain thee not. As near as an immortal sphered words could to a mother's soften, were these last. But yet I had a terror of her robes, and chiefly of her veils, that from her brow hung pale, and curtained her in mysteries, that made my heart too small to hold its blood. This saw that goddess, and with sacred hand parted the veils. Then saw I a wan face, not pined by human sorrows, but bright blanched by an immortal sickness which kills not. It works a constant change, which happy death can put no end to. Deathwards progressing to no death was that visage. It had passed the lily and the snow, and beyond these I must not think now, though I saw that face. But for her eyes I should have fled away. They held me back with a benignant light, soft mitigated by divinest lids half closed, and visionless entire they seemed of all external things. They saw me not, but in blank splendor beamed like the mild moon, who comforts those she sees not, who knows not what eyes are upward cast. So as I say, what we have there really is Keats squaring up to suffering, accepting that whether or not he likes it, it must be something that, as it were, shows up on his poetic radar. And I thought that I would, just before I read the last of his poems, it's always a bad idea to speak about Keats before you speak about yourself, because before I descend to talking about myself, is really what I'm trying to say. But I thought I'd read you just a little bit from one of his letters, which speaks to this business. This is a letter to his brother George, younger brother George, who of course immigrated to America. It's an extract from a Where am I going to start? Call the world, if you please, the veil of soul-making. Then you will find out the use of the world. I'm speaking now in the highest terms for human nature, admitting it to be immortal, which I will take here for granted for the purpose of showing a thought that has struck me concerning it. I say soul-making, soul as distinguished from an intelligence. There may be intelligences or sparks of the divinity in millions, but they are not souls till they acquire identities, till each one is personally itself. Intelligences are atoms of perception. They know and they see and they are pure. In short, they are God. But then are souls to be made? How then are these sparks which are God to have identity given them, so as ever to possess a bliss peculiar to each one's individual existence? How, but by the medium of a world like this? This point I sincerely wish to consider, because I think it is a grander system of salvation than the Christian religion, or rather, it is a system of spirit creation. So the idea is that the spirit is enriched by squaring up to suffering rather than simply crushed by it. And finally, from and by him, I thought that I would read you what must be one of the most famous poems in the language, which is the Ode to Autumn. Is the Ode to Autumn a kind of bailing out from social responsibilities, or is it another example of what can be done as a form of squaring up to it? Very fascinatingly, and I think very relevantly to how we think about the poem, immediately before writing it, Keats by this stage was living in a town called Winchester, which is south of London, for various reasons that we needn't go into. But he'd had to go back to town in order to meet the family lawyer, to try and screw some money out of the family lawyer, because, as usual, Keats was feeling very hard up. And it so happened that when he was in London making this visit to the lawyer, he had no choice but to mingle with people who'd recently come down from Manchester, where there'd been a big demonstration against the repressive government of the time, really by people who, and to put it into kind of contemporary terms, we would consider unionists. An enormous number of people who wanted to join unions at work had gathered to plead their cause and were very brutally put down by soldiers sent there by the British government in a catastrophe, really, that became known as the Peterloo Massacre. They'd gathered on the fields of Peterloo outside Manchester, and the government sent in troops on horses who just rode through the crowd with their sabres and killed a lot of people. So he comes back from London having mixed and mingled with these people. He'd come from Manchester down to London, many of them still with wreaths of flowers and stuff in their hair to show that their intent was peaceful. And to kind of manifest their politics. And again, very quickly, he writes, in another burst of activity, he writes the Ode to Autumn, which seems to be an example of somebody. Hang on, looking for my page here. Which seems to be an example of somebody avoiding the world and investing only in sensuous pleasures. But actually, the more you think about the pleasures that the poem talks about, the more you feel there's something problematic, difficult, oppressive perhaps even about them. The bees have been working too hard. Everything is in a state of excess. This is another poem which is set at a moment of penultimacy. Everything's about to go bad. And you can see how, there isn't really time to talk about this in the detail it deserves, but you can see how that sort of pressure in the poem, or those sorts of pressures, might be the result of political pressures around the writing of it. And there is one moment in particular that I think tells us something about Keats's radical politics, which is the use of the word gleaning. Gleaners were people who went through the fields after the harvest had been cut, picking up the loose grain that had fallen off the heads of the wheat, and simply putting it in their pockets, as they had been allowed to do until very recently before this poem was written. Gleaning had been made an illegal activity by the time this poem was written. The idea being the people who owned the land got everything on it, and there was no room for the people who lived in that vicinity to have a little bit of sort of a freebie, as had been the case in the long past. So as I read this poem, all of you will know it, but think about excess, think about the pressures in the poem, think about what's going to happen next, because I think that's what the poem is asking us to do when everything is going to go turn into winter in actual terms as well as symbolic ones. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee, sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swathe and all its twined flowers. And sometimes, like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then, in a wailful choir, the small gnats mourn along the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now, with treble soft, the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. So he wrote that poem on or about the 19th of September 1819 and was dead 18 months later. I'm going to read some of my own things now, and I'm going to begin by reading something that I wrote a while ago, which I want to say is about my mother, and it ends up being about my mum, this poem, but mainly it's about a horse being shoed. I grew up in the countryside, which and the bit of the countryside that I grew up in was much more sort of hairy than it now is, like a lot of England being so small. Everything's been tidied up, rather. But it was still it felt like real country, anyway. And my parents were very keen riders. So my brother and I had a pony, and my mum had a creature that was somewhere between being a pony and a horse. And its name was Serenade. Her name was Serenade. So this is about Serenade being shoed. There were the 2 ponies, and there was Serenade, which belonged to my mother. Though who belonged would be better, in view of the girlish head lift she had, and her flounce to and fro in the lumpy field, and that big womanish rump I always gave a wide berth to. When the blacksmith came to shoe her, which was seldom in summer, but otherwise often, she would let him hoist and stretch out first one hind leg, and then the other, with a definitely melancholy, embarrassed restraint. The blacksmith was ferret-faced and rat-bodied, hardly man enough to keep aloft the great weight of 1 foot at a time, though he did keep it sort of aloft, crouched over double and bent at the knees, to make a peculiar angle which held each hoof still on his battle-scarred apron. He would set up shop under the covered entranceway, between our house and the stable block, a ramshackle, clabbered affair, black or black weathering to green, with swallows' mud villages proliferating in the rafters. I liked it there in the drive-through, which was also where we parked the car, but not on his days, for the oil maps on the dusty cement, brilliant as the wet skin of a trout, and for the puzzling swallow-ship patterns, and most of all for that place by the corner drain, where a grass snake had appeared once, an electric green, sleepy-looking marvel, which, when it disappeared, left a print of itself that stayed in the mind forever. The blacksmith always did cold shoeing, prizing off each thin moon crescent, then carving the hoof with a bone-handled, long-bladed knife. The miracle of no pain. Serenade gone loose in her skin, her strength out of her so she seemed suspended in water, her hypnotized breathing steady, the smell of musty hay and ammonia sweat coming off her, her head dropping down, eyes half closed now, and me a boy, watching the earth-stained sole of her hoof turning pure white as the blacksmith pared and trimmed, leaving the nervous diamond of the frog well alone, but showing me, just by looking, how even to touch that, much worse cut it, would wake her and break the spell, and our 2 heads with it. Our collie dog sat near where the snake had been, ravenous black and white, all ears, sometimes fidgeting her 2 slim front feet, glancing away as if about to dash off, then twisting back, licking her lips and swallowing with a half whine. She knew better than to get under anyone's feet, but when the blacksmith had done with his cutting and offered a new shoe and fiddled it downwards or sideways and hammered it with quick hits which drove the nail points clean through, but these could be filed off later and were. When this was all done, he kicked the clippings across the cement, and now it was the collie's turn to show a sad restraint, taking one delicate piece between her pink lips, ashamed to be a slave of appetite, and curving away into the yard to eat it in private. The blacksmith straightened himself, one hand smoothing the small of his back, the other picking a few remaining nails from between his own darker lips, then slapped Serenade on the flank with his red palm, rousing her from her trance, running his fingers up her mane and over her ears, giving each a soft tug and saying, "She'll do," or "Good lady," or "There's a girl." Whereupon my mother herself appeared to pay him. Their hands met and touched and parted, and something passed between them, and the blacksmith took of his apron with its colours of a battered tin bowl, folded it, and carried it before him in a lordly fashion, using it as a cushion for his collapsed bag of hammers, clippers, knives, files, pliers, and nails, to the van, which he had parked in the lane some distance from us, while my mother untied the halter and led her horse away. there was a crisp clip-clop over the stable yard, and a train of hoofprints with the neat shoes obvious to me, who had stayed behind with nothing better to do than look. This was Serenade, who would later throw my mother as they jumped out of a wood into sunlight, and who, taking all possible pains not to trample her down or even touch her, was nevertheless the means to an end, which was death. Now I am as old as my mother was then, at the time of her fall, and I can see Serenade clearly in her own later life. Poor, dumb creature nobody blamed, or could easily like any more either, which meant nobody came to talk to her much in the spot she eventually found under the spiky may tree in the field, and still less came to shoe her, so her hooves grew long and crinkled round the edges like wet cardboard, except they were hard, while she just stood there, not knowing what she had done, or went off with her girlish flounce and conker-coloured arse, waiting for something important to happen, only nothing ever did, beyond the next day and the next, and one thing leading to another. Yes. That's very nice of you. Thank you. My wife and I have lived in Baltimore for the last 10 years. And as Jake kindly was pointing out when he was introducing this, I teach at Johns Hopkins, which I love. And we became friendly, knowing nobody in Baltimore when we got there, with a guy called Joe Harrison, the poet, who, towards the end of 2024, got a very aggressive kind of cancer and very quickly died of it. And this is a poem about Joe, which has, how many parts does it have? It's got a few little bits to it. So I'll read this and maybe then... These are sonnets, unrhymed sonnets, though there is a lot of rhyming going on in them. It just doesn't happen very much at the end of the line. Joe was a talkative person, and in his final illness, he was full of ideas for getting people round on a kind of regular basis to talk with him about the things that he cared about, Shakespeare particularly. But he died so quickly there wasn't a chance for any of that to happen. But after my first visit to him in his illness, when he was still living at home, I thought that I was going to want to write something about him when he eventually died. But wouldn't it be nicer if I wrote something about him that he could read before he died? But it all happened so quickly. In fact, he never did see this poem. So it's an elegy in all sorts of traditional ways, but it's slightly unusual in that its subject was still alive when I was writing it. The poem is called Largo. Largo, as you know, means played with a sort of deliberate slowness when you see it in musical notation, and that's what I had in mind. And indeed it starts in a way that I thought might entertain him, with a reference to a bit of music, but not a piece of classical music, but a piece of music by Jimi Hendrix. Hey, Joe, no chair have I without your say-so even perched upon, before you're telling me the docs have given you a year, then what exactly? Oh, live mind goes blank, mine does, goes blank, reboots, then spins away, while yours revs off talk. See that? Window, winter, flowers of frost, and that? Blue sky is paradise already. Joe, I know, all minutes now are days, but here on earth, in normal circuits round the clock, I must think quickly, slowly too. Are you sitting comfortably? Who, their head shoved through the clock face, would not fail as badly as they have it in them to? Not you. Your courage comes in everywhere, not weeping all the bloody time, but talking like a sane man very stoned. That beard, those bloated ankles, odd distorts and plasters give the game away, though, Joe, you own the gift by passing it along, We'll speak of nothing untoward. Toward, the very word to slip its arm through courage, and if dignity is what we're after, go for a saunter. You talk. I will, but warn you, Joe, talk is not first nature. I blame Dad. His silence fathomless. I tried. Some years there were performance was the thing put on. Now much alone is quiet my preferred. But you let rip and cover for me, do. You have the dire advantage, Joe. You did your best and still will go again, no higher praise. To make it, waiting, like an end itself, okay? When I stood at his grave to kick the first loud flints and clay lumps in, then spin a clatter of red topsoil down, that knock-knock on his coffin lid restored the no reply he loved to give. In talk poetical we walk through silence but still live in it, and best of what we say partakes. The heartache and the natural stuff, what happens when so many finishes combine. It builds like weather through the generations of our grief will not be long. Such arctic sweep, such oceanic roll of sadness would we, if our dignity allowed, release. I think, and do not like to, I admire the gas fire flickering, which causes light to move, but nothing else. The earth turns patiently, to say the least. Not every human body starts out shy, though some are born, while others more discover theirs becoming so. But here we are, still talkative, me wriggled in between your cake stand and a stack of stiff back numbers of the tried and true New York Review of Books, some inside out I notice for a second look. Ashamed of my good health and how its ironies abound, while you, Joe, in your Dodgem wheelchair can't, despite your instincts, help but demonstrate what radiation does, or how collapsing wildly among the splinters of yourself is no good way to hide. You say, I used by gardens made of wilderness to walk. This medicine does not agree. In Alabama. Now I live on fronds of such, or vines I dare remember dangle, no escape, or trout streams rainbowing through elm trunks iron-barked. It does me good, this armchair travelling. I left my footprints also nearer home in crescent moons of grit, Gunpowder River with a noose of light drew tight, where wizened puffs of foam bob weightless in the swirl, though yellowish, still pretty, even those the inward eye still toys with, given half a chance. Light briefly hesitates in blue, then dies. It's nothing new, but still surprise will catch us out. A breeze has always somewhere else to be, while bullets in the leaves pursue, flip, 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 flip. Is that a kind of cry? Most of what I knew for sure, I wonder over now. It's how things are. Words we used to weigh have each replaced what once they stood for. Now our souls forever travelling through space extending to the furthest wall, and saved there, all sounds ever made, not dead but desolate. Limbo, as in sickness, when eyes ravenous for purchase choose what comfort is, a sheltering within without, or countless counting when the body won't let go. You can't will someone not to be, or can you, Joe? The cost of suffering is yours to know. The boat heaves to, and something like a hand, but made of shadow, beckons you on board. Deciding justifies delay. It is the pause, deserves your thought for now. Thank you. Philip Larkin, whose biography I also wrote immediately before I wrote about Keats, and who was a good friend of mine for the last 10 years of his life. We worked at the same university in England. had an amusing way of talking about poems often. I mean, amusing and brilliant way of talking about poems. And one of the stories that he liked to tell, or liked to tell me anyway, I think to put me off writing altogether probably, was how a writer in residence had recently arrived at the town that we both lived in. And he, Larkin, who was not a sociable person, liked staying at home very much more than he liked going out, was persuaded to go to a little party to welcome this guy who'd arrived to be the writer in residence at the university, who was delighted to see him, Larkin, in the room, and made a beeline for him and squeezed him into the corner of the sofa and sat down next to him, sort of pinning him in there, and then did what I think in Larkin's view was the absolutely unforgivable thing of delving into his inside pocket and pulling out a poem that this guy had recently written, and giving it to Larkin to read. It was really Larkin's idea of hell, I think. And his mind clearly going completely blank, staring at this printed page, or typewritten page, whatever it was. Not being able to think of what he might say. Situation which I have to say I've been in many times myself. But the silence was eventually broken, not by Philip himself saying, "A wonderful poem, thank you very much," but by the guy who'd written the poem saying, "It goes on over the page." So this is a poem, I'm sorry to tell you, which goes on over the page. Really what I've been doing for the last nearly 4 years now, that poem about Joe was a bit of an interruption to what I have been doing, which is writing a very, very long poem, which is a kind of diary, journal, though I don't want to give the impression that these aren't deliberated, the sections to this poem. All the sections are the same length, they're all 12 lines long. And I thought, given the perils of writing a long poem, it would be a good idea to take the Dante route and provide myself with a guide in the way that Dante had Virgil guiding him through the underworld and beyond. And my guide is John Berryman, rather the spirit of John Berryman, a poet I greatly like. And one of the bits that I'm going to read you, he appears. So intermittently through the course of this long poem, which is called Gravity Archives, Berryman appears, and my speaker, he has a conversation with him. And as I say, in one of these bits that I'm going to read you, you'll meet him. Berryman, as you know, died jumping off a bridge. There's a lot in the poem about falling in one way or another, falling over, falling in love. A lot of the poems I'm about to read you are about my wife. Every kind of falling that you can imagine. I've never read any of this poem before, so I'm not at all sure what it's going to sound like. My hope is that it won't sound too broken up. I'll just go belting through a few of them and then stop. This comes from the beginning of the second chapter of the poem. The first is set in England, with us leaving England, and here we are arriving in Baltimore. Homesickness, feeling very disoriented, thinking about things as they come up, but also brooding on sort of long-term preoccupations of mine. Frayed patience of exile, flights delayed or gone, lost connections and layovers, federal tyrants ballooning in uniform, nodding epics of romance. But I insist still. In the latest hub, or one looming, with smoking rooms rammed and inquiries snubbed by shrugs, grunts, scowls and eye rolls, windows flaunt runways with clouds grazing blue pastures. When story can't move on, do we call this one? High sky battle lines waver in torpid succession, borders deliquesce, but we, love, flashed old home the finger and now angle to each other. I'll fetch 2 bottles of water, you watch my seat. Basement born I was, but attics grew to love, an egoist and time I knew myself. Hot air rising, bound to be a risk, but I have promises to make in this life newly bound. I lay my hand on glass and clearly see through here and now to next, despite the birch tree below my window tapping on and off to catch my eye. Such prettiness I like. Our first night here, stuff in transit still, we threw a mattress down, and on the floor began the time we live in now. White door, white walls, and beams too weak to hang myself, I could not help but think, before I shut my eyes and other dreams flew down. Distraction swept me. Let me ask again, what was it, John, you thought to think in that quick interval between? How soon came nothing with its terror or relief? How little done and infinite to do? I ask, particular to me and now. The odd thing is, why end up on dry land? Miscalculation just? Or batterly the chance you might take wing, a swooping swallow dive designed to end in skim? But oh, to coin a sound, you'd settled that already. Words it was, in words our certain flight. Home in name, though particles of mind still race in dust trails comet-wise across fat slabs of black Atlantic swell. Now dreams arrive before sleep closes in, with days rewinding and the itch to understand new strangeness and safe recognitions both. My dead look on, keep burying themselves to rise again, but you and I, love, lying side by side, decide our life and settle what is true. Above our bed, indifferently, the fan unravels from the ceiling chains of air that melt on contact and are nowhere seen. Exile of our sort, chosen, is natural fact, setting loose self which lives well outside self, all eyes, equipped to manage distance. I want, cry children pointing out a star. Our star now rises in the pause between a thought and understanding it to license everlasting. What music is this muffled drum off stage? Ancient blood hymns, wounds I never meant. And now dawn brings America as well. A bright day stripped of camouflage, no wind, explosions of a red geranium, your rising face, with blush blooms darkening your bare brown throat. Afoot where I no longer wish to be, I stamped and fled the drizzling archipelago to set me down with atomies unknown. But here as well, dissensions pullulate where God drew back, or died, or never was, and feelings arbitrate. Remind me, love, how they and lyric operate when dead in millions simmering like leaves inform the breeze and dazzle now with messages from then no longer suited to the world we occupy. Mind chops forward in regret, forgets the aim it took and wanted bad as life, which finished somewhere other than it thought. What that is, look, slick harbour water sweltering to swell above its wall, the sun unleashed, appalling in its burn, Charm City, Baltimore. Is it just me, or do the swallows here speak with more definite intent? I like and don't to think migration starts before they hurl their scimitars and leave, which will, come fall, restore the echoing my voice makes in the hallway. Anyone at home? I could go on, but I'm not going to. Thank you. I'm just going to end by reading, you'll be relieved to hear, another very short poem, one of the other short poems that I've tucked in around this monster. And because it's such a creepily warm day, given that it's the middle of October, I thought I would read you, if I can find it, a poem that is about snow. Remember that? And then Jake and I will have our conversation. So, snow. Where in the world did the world go when the snow unpacked its infinite number of blank disguises in every conceivable size? And where did sound disappear when noisy ground pulled up this weight of white? Is there a nowhere now becoming a somewhere hidden from hearing and sight? Somewhere like death, but not underground or the end forever. Oh, I would like to know. In fact, I would like to arrive there now, rather than lie in this muddle of dull and dazzling light and wait for the scrape of a shovel below my window, like someone clearing their throat, and for my name as it thaws and enters my brain again, with all I regret, to launch its lonely surprise. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much for coming to Pittsburgh. It's such an honor to have you here. To give you a sense of how incredible it is to have Sir Andrew Motion here, I received yesterday an email from a professor abroad saying, I've been desperate to attend one of their readings. I looked at flights to Pittsburgh. I was unable to make it. But this has made ripples across the pond. But how's your time in Pittsburgh been so far?
Fantastic. Fantastic. Many years ago, I came very briefly to Pittsburgh because I was writing a biography of somebody who'd briefly spent some time here. But I didn't have a chance then to look around. And actually, in a way, we haven't had that much chance to look around this time either. But you have thrown in our path all kinds of temptations which make it highly likely that we'll be coming back soon to. It's a gracious, muscular, beautiful, and particularly on a day like this, wonderful, wonderful looking city, I think. Genuinely, I will be saying this behind your back. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. We both are.
Wonderful. Well, Keats' story of staying up all night reading Homer, I'm so glad you opened with that. I had a colleague describe that as the first sort of Netflix binge equivalent, right, where Keats is so taken, he stays up all night with Homer. I know you've spoken a lot about your high school teacher, Mr. Way, who opened the door to poetry for you. Was there a text that was equivalent for you, where you felt absolutely sucked in as a young reader?
Actually, there was. As I was intimating, my background was not a literary one. My mum read a bit, my dad hardly at all. I mean, he used to say that he'd read half a book in his life, and I think he was probably telling the truth. It was a book which was described as a thriller, but obviously not very thrilling for him. And I have some memories of him bringing it year after year on holiday, and impatiently turning over the pages while it was raining, and then when the rain stopped, gratefully throwing it aside and doing the things that he preferred to do, like going fishing. So it was very much against the run of play, or against the run of expectation anyway, that I would spend my life doing the things that I have and continue to spend it doing. And the fact that I do now live and work and think and feel, etc., as I do, has got a great deal to do with this man whose name you nicely remember, Peter Way, who started teaching me English when I was 16 years old. And I very vividly still remember the day when he asked us to, which was, I think, the first lesson I ever had with him. He dished out the school anthology, which was very unsexily called Theme and Variations, and told us to turn to page whatever it was, on which was a poem by Thomas Hardy, of which the title is the first line, and it goes, I look into my glass and view my wasting skin and think, would God it came to pass my heart had shrunk as thin, for then I, undistressed by hearts grown cold to me, could lonely wait my endless rest with equanimity. But time, to make me grieve, part steals, lets part abide, and shakes this fragile frame at eve with throbbings of noontide. So an extraordinary poem to give to a room full of testosterone-fueled adolescents, boys. It was a boys' school. And in fact, the guy sitting next to me, who I remember was called Nixon, immediately put his hand up cheekily and said, what sort of throbbing are we talking about here? which at the time seemed, I just was so embarrassed by the question, I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me. But now that I'm as old as I am, it seems actually rather the right question, though I can't remember how Peter Way answered it. But I did feel that that poem, as you can see, go into me like a spear. Not only, I must say, with the sense that what an extremely beautiful and simple seeming but emotionally subtle poem it is, but also with a dawning feeling of, I want to do that. I mean, not only I want to write poems, but also if I'm going to, I'd like to do it in a tradition of writing, in a way of writing, which is roughly an inheritance of what Hardy and other poets like Hardy, like Edward Thomas, who's not very well known in this country, but a wonderful poet, and indeed Philip Larkin, were doing. In other words, using language which seems to be simple, but is really a sort of lens, clear lens, through which you can look down into these complicated emotional states.
We were talking last night about the high school teachers in our lives. Just curious, a show of hands for the people in the audience with much of an experience of poetry, who got into the art because of a high school teacher?
There you go.
Yeah, about half the room.
Yeah.
We do for the International Poetry Forum a lot of high school programs. That's what got me into the art originally. But you continue to work with students now in the capacity of a professor, and we solicited some questions online, and I received more than any other people wanting to know what the sort of young scene looks like for poetry. So you're working with undergraduates, graduates. They want to know if you're despairing, if you're optimistic.
Well, that's very interesting. I feel rather, I feel two almost opposite things about this. I mean, the question of what poetry is writing about now is almost too enormous to go in here. But so what I'm going to do, if I may, is to answer the question in terms of sort of audience for or reach of poetry, because there's very little doubt that in this country, and this is true for the UK as well, the traditional spaces for poetry are drastically fewer and reduced compared to what they used to be through the first half of my life. Where is poetry reviewed? Much, much less than it used to be, and it was never that much. I think the sales of poetry books have fallen sort of over the piece on both sides of the Atlantic, and that all looks like bad news for poetry. But on the other hand, and at the same time, the space that's opened up for poetry online is absolutely borderless, enormous. One of the things that I did when I was working as Poet Laureate back in the old country was set up a thing which is kind of like your Poetry Foundation here, called the Poetry Archive, which is a website that has poets reading their own work on it, with a lot of kind of educational material added to it. And as I was saying with you last night, by the time that I moved over here 10 years ago, we had, I think, 1 million pages of poetry being looked at every month. And this was, as it were, good stuff. People had to have published books in order to be eligible for consideration for the site. So it is possible, rather remarkably, to say there are more people reading poetry now than they've ever done before. But because the internet is like the Wild West in every respect, you don't quite know what's going on. I mean, these people might be reading it, but what are they then doing with it? I mean, are they thinking, right, I'm now going to go out and do something completely, sort of, as it were, unpoetical? Or are they thinking, this is the beginning of a lifelong romance? You know? I just don't know the answer to that. The one thing that, I mean, when I'm asked to think about, or I'm myself thinking about the future of poetry, the only thing I can say that I feel certain about is that the next really good thing is almost impossible to predict, because its unpredictability will make it the good thing, you know.
Yeah, you did something remarkable in an interview 10 years ago. Someone asked about your influences, and I've never heard someone do this. Usually when someone's asked about their influences, they name people who are older, people who are deceased. You named someone younger. You named, it was Alice Oswald, who went on to be Oxford Professor of Poetry, so yeah. I so admire. But to look back in the other direction, I know there are many crossovers with your career and the International Poetry Forum. You've run across a number of our other alumni. W.H. Auden was a tutor of yours at Oxford, is that correct?
Well, I certainly had sessions with him. I had been, and still am, very keen on the poems of Louis MacNeice, Auden's friend and contemporary. And with the brass neck of youth, because I'd worked out that MacNeice's literary executor, a former professor of Greek at Oxford, and the author of The Greeks and the Irrational, a wonderful book that's actually stood the test of time extremely well, was now retired from university but still living outside the town. A friend and I went to visit Dodds, and we became good friends of Dodds, who was himself a very good friend of Auden's. Auden by this time was still dividing his time between New York and Austria, but he wasn't that old actually, but in his version of old age, Christchurch College, his college at Oxford, had taken pity on him and had offered him a lease at a sort of cheap rate in one of their cottages within the sort of, as it were, purview of the college. And Dodds took me to supper with Auden there. And on the way out, he said, "I expect you're writing poems, send me some and come and see me next week." So through that semester, or that term, I used to see him every afternoon, every Wednesday afternoon, I think it was, at 4:00. And Dodds had warned me that Auden was fantastically keen on being punctual, and I must not be late. So I used to get there probably and I felt as though I was getting there about a day early, and would knock on the door as the bell in Christchurch rang 4:00 so that he would know I was punctual, and then we'd go upstairs and sit and talk about the poems that I dropped off the week before. This was my very early experience of what is now completely commonplace, which is creative writing courses. I don't think there might have been one creative writing equivalent of an MFA program in a British university then. There are now over 50. I mean, it's as commonplace as it is in this country. And so although I have no first-hand experience of actually being a student in a creative writing program, I only have experience of running them. Those sessions with Auden really were my equivalent of a creative writing program, I think. By which I mean two things. One was that he did give me some very good advice, practical advice, and we would read line by line through the poems and say, "That's not working, why not think about that?" And having conversations about form and so on and so forth. But also just to be in the company of somebody that I absolutely idolized meant that I came out of those sessions, which were only an hour and a half, really walking on air, thinking I'd spent the afternoon with God. You know, that's how it felt. But part of that was not. But what I mean as I say that is not only that I think it's very good for young writers to have somebody to look up to aspire to, but also that even though I did have this tremendous, and still do, tremendous admiration for him as a writer, and actually as a man too, a kind man, kind, shy man, I also thought he's a human being. And it was, so that there was that about it too. It made writing poems generally seem more possible, and seemed, I mean, this is a hubristic thing for me to be saying, but so please take it in the spirit in which I'm meaning it. It made it possible to think that you could write a good poem one day, or that I could write a good poem one day, and that I didn't have to go and have a complete sort of makeover. I could still be me and do it. And I remember I often used to look at his hands and think, that's the hand that wrote these wonderful poems. So it humanized poetry for me in a very fundamental way.
And I know Seamus Heaney, another alum of our series, who was anyone able to attend? Seamus Heaney visited the International Poetry Forum 5 times throughout his lifetime. Was anyone here able to attend? Oh, great, a few hands in the audience. What was your experience of encountering his poetry?
I first read him at school, Peter Way again. I bought Seamus's first book when it came out, encouraged by Peter to do this. We didn't meet him until quite a lot later, actually, but he was always immensely courteous. In fact, I really used to worry a bit by how kind Seamus was. He always had time for everybody. I don't know whether this is, I'm sure it was your experience of him too. And I often used to leave him thinking, why are you so nice to people? Why don't you just sort of lock yourself away a bit and write more poetry instead? But I think partly because he was just put together like that, but also because he had a sense, in the most unshow-offy way imaginable, of being a kind of global ambassador for poetry. He was endlessly patient and time-taking with people, and a wonderful proselytizer for poetry. A great human being and a great poet.
Well, we have time for one more question. Just to note that on the hour, we'll have to leave for the airport. So after this question, we're going to have signatures. Their books are for sale by our friends from City of Asylum Bookstore. So if you'd like to bring up a book for signature, I'll say in advance, if you wouldn't mind coming up this way from the stage, and if you wouldn't mind sort of as promptly as you can moving through, so we make sure that we do not miss a flight. Just to say that in advance of to induce anxiety.
Much as I like Pittsburgh.
In advance of trying to keep you here, in advance of the final question, which is both you and the founder of the International Poetry Forum, Samuel Hazo, have very similar quotations describing poetry as oxygen. Yeah. And one of the most encouraging things about this reading series is that at least one person approaches me afterwards saying, I'm ready, this is the time in my life, I'm confronting more mortality, I'm having children, whatever it is, I'm ready to get myself into poetry. So, impossibly broad question, but if someone approaches and says, I'm really ready to approach this, do you have any avenues you recommend into either reading or writing poetry fresh?
I think if you're coming to it not knowing very much about it, it can look absolutely terrifying, poetry, a kind of great impenetrable wall. And an awful lot of people don't find it easy to approach because, and I say this very respectfully about teachers being one myself, because they've had rather a bad time with poetry at school, and they've somehow or other they've got the impression that to be interested in poetry is like becoming a mason, and you have to learn all kinds of kind of weird rules and have one leg of your trousers rolled up and have a funny handshake. And but like Sam, I've always, as you can see, I've always felt that poetry is actually like breathing. I mean, it is oxygen, but it's as natural as breathing. Sure, it has its own rules and regulations, but so does driving the car have rules and regulations. And why poetry should be, sort of categorized as this uniquely difficult thing, I don't know, except that it often is wrapped up with these sort of prickly ways. But I do understand how off-putting, how daunting it can seem. So I think, though this sounds a rather sort of humdrum thing to say, the best way to approach it is to find a really good anthology and not expect to enjoy every page equally. And the best anthology, again, I was saying, I think, in your hearing last night, I strongly recommend that you get the Penguin Book of English Verse. It's called, edited by a guy called Paul Keegan, who used to be my editor at Faber in London, which has the very good idea of printing its poems, which are from kind of early English through to more or less now. I think Paul Muldoon is the youngest person in it. Printing them not according to the birth date of the poet in question, or indeed the first collected appearance of the poem in a book or whatever, but from the date of being written, where that can be established. So the anthology creates an extremely strong sense of the flow of poetry through generations, with everybody kind of swiping bits out of their contemporaries, building on the work of their contemporaries. And you can see the process of evolution in a very slow and fascinating way as you read the book. But as I say, having said that, you mustn't feel that you have to read every page and enjoy it equally. Just turn over the page if you're not having a good time, and with luck you'll find something better and more to your taste on the next page.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking Andrew for this wonderful reading, for coming to Pittsburgh.